Let's try that.
Okay, I'm going to turn that off. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
If you can hear me, raise your hand. Good. Okay, good. Yeah, no, these poor people up front, they're going to have hearing aids after this. Oh, gosh. We even got our son Robert and his wife involved in this. Robert took a push lawnmower and tried to get all those weeds, as many as he could. And of course, Allison, his wife, got out a shovel and attacked those cotton picking prickly pears. I don't have a good history with prickly pears, so that was my main priority, to get those cotton picking prickly pears out of that cemetery. We had soap, water, brushes, and we scrubbed the headstones. The cemetery looked like a different place when we had entered the gate than when we had entered the gate months before. It was a good feeling. There was a good spirit there. August 1998, 45 descendants came from Idaho, Montana, and Utah. Holly's headstone was set, and her grave was dedicated by her grandson, Melvin Weeks. We had worked hard, we had laughed, cried, and it was beautiful. And we made plans to come back and do it again and again. When we came back to Idaho, after being gone for a number of years, I decided I wanted to get back into my family history and see just what I had been missing in the last few years. And so I started looking, and it was so confusing because, as you can imagine, in the valley, there was a cemetery in Ivan Weeks' backyard, and there's a cemetery in my mom and dad's backyard. So there's 2 Weekses with cemeteries in them. So obviously people were going to get confused about it. When people would talk about the Weeks Cemetery, they usually meant the Ivan Weeks Cemetery. And people would say to me, well, in your cemetery, are the Statons there? And I said, no, there's no Statons in that cemetery. By this time, we had decided, because the land originally belonged to the Burtons that my folks lived on in their field, we decided to name it the Burton Cemetery. And fortunately, they decided to name Ivan's cemetery the Swan Valley Cemetery. So it got a little less confusing about the cemeteries. Well, Dean and I decided we needed to do more research and find out where the Statons were buried. Maybe they were in the Burton Cemetery. Well, we found out they're not in the Burton Cemetery until we found out one was. But where they are, you know where the gravel pit is down in Irwin? Okay, if you look out from the road, there's a fence, there's a mound and a fence around that mound. There are 5 Statons buried in there. The state owns the pit, but we talked to them and they guaranteed us that they would never bother that Staton cemetery. 3 of the graves are marked. A.R.W. Staton, father. A.R.W. Staton, baby. Edna Staton, no marker. Gertrude Staton and Ephraim Staton, and we're not sure which one of those graves is marked. In searching the Staton's information, we discovered there is a Staton in the Burton Cemetery. Eldora Bell Staton, buried at the foot of her grandfather's grave, Charles Burton, unmarked. She was the child of Caroline Skelton Burton and William Staton. She only lived 1 month. We wanted to find her grave and put in a headstone for her too. So out came the shovels, the measuring tape, and a metal detector, hoping to find a rusted soup can. We found it. There under the dirt was another rusted soup can with the remnants of plastic flowers and leaves in it and wires. So There are many unmarked graves in the Burton Cemetery, as well as the old part of the Swan Valley Cemetery. I wish we could identify them all. I love learning about the people in these cemeteries and their stories. I love it. It is a passion with me now. Without them, most of us wouldn't be here. Let me tell you about some of them. In the Burton Cemetery, Horatio Harris Weeks, the son of Samuel and Laura Weeks, died at 8 years old from appendicitis attack. David Weeks died at the age of 16. He was riding on a haystack, on a wagon, hauling hay, and got struck by lightning. And the story is that it also killed the 2 horses that was pulling the wagon. That year was 1910. Charles Burton came over from England in 1873 with his wife Hannah and kids, William, Anne, Elizabeth, and Alice, on the ship Wyoming. I don't know why it couldn't be the ship Idaho, but it was the ship Wyoming. Jettie, Polly, Caroline, and Jim were born after they reached America. Charles died in 1899. His headstone is metal. We discovered it was ordered from Montgomery Ward. His family settled the Palisade area in the Snake River. Helen Elizabeth Jacobson, Dora Daniels' little sister, drowned in a small ditch near the family home, 6 years old, the year 1900, excuse me. When my grandpa was with us in 1988, there was a pile of dirt and rocks and stuff in the cemetery, and we said, oh man, we need to level that out. And he says, oh, wait a minute. And he told us a story. He said that one night in Irwin, a guy came in on his horse in the wintertime, and they found him the next morning on the ground, dead. Now, they didn't know if he was drunk and then fell off and froze, or if he was froze and then fell off and died. They weren't sure. But what they did is they took him down to the Burton Cemetery, and nobody wanted to dig his grave for him. They said, we don't know this guy. The ground's frozen. Who wants to dig a grave for this guy? Well, nobody raised their hand. So they made a very shallow grave, and then they piled rocks and dirt on top of him. So my grandpa said, you don't want to mess with that pile. Needless to say, we have not messed with that pile. A few years ago, I was contacted by some of my Grandma Opal Marshall Weeks' family. They knew that great-grandpa John Horsey Marshall, one of the very early settlers of the valley, had died in 1937. He was buried in the Swan Valley Cemetery, but they didn't know where. Did we think we could help them find their grave?
Oh, yeah.
The pressure was on. Fortunately, when I had been interviewing Dora Daniels for some of the information that I was gathering, she told me. She said, your great-great-grandpa, John Horsey Marshall, is buried by my husband, Ed Daniels, kind of kitty corner from him. So once again, we got out the measuring tape, the shovels, the rakes, and the metal detector, hoping we would be successful. We began to look for signs of Grandpa John Horsey Marshall's grave. The metal detector beeped and beeped again. Hopefully, we dug about 5 inches down. There it was, a rusty, old, mashed soup can. Family members were ecstatic. Someone we all loved was honored with another beautiful headstone. We have found 3 unmarked graves, and the common denominator has been a rusty old soup can. We learned something very interesting about the cemetery at Calamity. Before they put the dam in, the government knew the cemetery was there at Calamity, and they said, well, it's going to be covered with water. Well, the people in Grand Valley said, well, you just guess again. because that is not going to be buried with water. We want those people dug up and relocated. So the government said, okay. So they hired 2 guys from the valley here. They went in, dug up all the graves, put them in 2 great big metal boxes, and buried them in Irwin. Now, just for identification purposes, we called that at that time the Burton Burial Ground. I don't know who owned the land when they put it in there, but for our information and what we were trying to keep track of, we just called it the Burton Burial Ground. It is at highway marker 382 on the old Irwin, or on Highway 26, right through past Irwin. The property is now owned by Rod Brunsberg, and he hasn't messed with them. He says, I figured that that was probably somebody buried there, and we're not going to mess with them. My dad and my Uncle Jay both remembered the white picket fence that went around that burial ground. You can't find it now, but they remember it being there. Supposedly, there was a man that was living near Calamity, and another man wanted his property. And the guy said, no, I'm not selling. I'm not interested in selling. Well, he was found later with a bullet hole in his forehead. So, when those people dug up those graves, they found a skull with a bullet in the middle of his forehead. Fiction, fact, speculation, I don't know. I love the stories that are told that you find in the cemetery. I hope you have enjoyed some of the experiences and the things we've learned in our research. I'm honored to share these things with you today. It's a passion for me at this point. I thank you for inviting me. Most records are kept at the mortuaries or county coroners. Records after the 1950s are fairly accurate, but records before that time are very hard to find. If you're looking for information, a good resource are your family's histories, and interview the older people. They are an excellent resource, and they're not always going to be here. I am so thankful and appreciate the people that have taken care of the Swan Valley Cemetery and have brought it up to date. It is so time-consuming and expensive, but so rewarding. Once the spirit of those you are serving hits you, you are addicted. I believe the veil between this life and the afterlife is very thin. They can send us messages. We just need to pay attention. I want to tell you one more story. I hope I have time. I'm not going over my time limit here. I have to tell you about a couple, Dan and Rhonda Heflin. They lived in Washington State. I met Rhonda on an internet group of how to take care of Quaker parents, and that's a whole nother story that you don't even want to go to. But we got to be really, really good friends. And so her and her husband Dan decided they'd never been to Idaho before. They wanted to come down and meet us. So they did. They came down and stayed with us for about 4 days, and we had a riot. We just really had a good time. We took them to all the wonders of this valley. We took them to the Tetons. We took them boating in canoes for the first time they'd ever been boating. And Rhonda says, I don't want to go. I don't know how to swim. I said, it's a shallow river. You're not going to have to worry about it. You'll have on a life jacket. You're going to be fine. Right off the bat, trying to get in the canoe, she's in the river. Okay, we got her out of the river and in the canoe. The rest of the trip, all we heard from her, we're all gonna die. I said, no, we're gonna be fine. You're gonna be fine. Just stay in the canoe. You're gonna be fine. Well, she told me that her and Dan were both alcoholics, that she had quit drinking and had been sober for about 13 years. But Dan just couldn't quite break the habit. And unfortunately, in 2010, Dan passed away. Shortly after that, Rhonda got very, very sick. Although she had quit drinking, the damage was done, and she needed a transplant of her liver. So her son came out from Tennessee to Washington to get her, to take her back to Tennessee. Unfortunately, she was so sick, she couldn't make that long of a trip. So her son said, "Can we leave her here with us?" Well, my first instinct was, I don't think so. But then stronger words came to me that, yeah, we needed to help. We needed to do that. So, and he just wanted us to get her healthy enough that she could fly to South Carolina to get a transplant. So I thought, okay, that's not going to be too bad. 3 months later, she's still at my house. And barely by then, took us 3 months to get her healthy enough to travel to South Carolina. One day she says, "You know what, I need some stuff out of my stuff in the shed. Will you help me out there and look through stuff and help me find it?" I said, "Sure." So we went out there and I got her sat down and I looked through some boxes for things that she needed, and I think it was pajamas or something. I don't remember just what it was she needed. And I found this box that was about the size of a jewelry box, a wooden box. And she said, "Oh, that's Dan's ashes." It took me a minute to get my head wrapped around that. Those were Dan's ashes? He had been out in my shed for over a month? Okay. And she just looked at me and I said, "Well, no wonder I didn't recognize him." She just laughed and she says, "Put him in the dumpster." I said, "No, I can't do that." I said, "We can leave him here. He can stay right here." She says, okay, leave him here. After she got to South Carolina, she couldn't meet the criteria for the transplant. We talked a number of times on the phone before she died in 2012. She wasn't close to her son. She was very concerned. Now she was homeless. She considered herself homeless. And she wondered what was going to happen to her ashes. And I said, "Well, I know what's going to happen. You have your son send me the ashes, and we'll bury you in our cemetery out in the field." Because she had been there amid the prickly pears and stuff. She knew what it looked like and said, "Oh, okay, great, you'll do that?" And I said, "Yes, no problem, we'll do that." And she says, I said to her, I said, "Yeah, we'll bury Dan out there too." And she says, wait a minute. You haven't put Dan in the dumpster yet?" I said, "Rhonda, you know I can't do that." She says, "Okay, fine. But you bury him in the farthest most corner away from me that you possibly can." I said, I'll do what I can do, Rhonda. Okay. Well, her son sent us her ashes. We already had Dan's, obviously. And it was really interesting because Rhonda told me she was going to give me her laptop too. She wanted me to have her laptop. So here comes the laptop. I have to sign for the laptop. Here come the ashes. Did I have to sign for the ashes? No. I thought that was kind of funny. I just kind of chuckled at that. Well, we took Dan and Rhonda down to the Burton Cemetery, and they share a headstone. Right next to my great-grandma Polly. Now I know when I get to the other side, I'm going to have some explaining to do. I'm just hoping that by that time, they'll like each other again.